towards Nazism was definitely not a kind of it was not an ethical nor non-ethical act in that way of thinking. And incorporating these couple of scenes into the movie were, I suppose, director's intention to show that there was a disagreement between her and him during the earlier period. But those scenes, for me, do not fit and do not provoke any kind of nor intellectual stimulation, nor help us to understand the story or the plot which is described in the movie.
I understood those scenes as von Trotte's way of accounting for and explaining to a certain extent the charge that the opponents of Arendh are making in their New York debates, right? Not simply did you get Eichmann wrong, but it has something to do with the fact that you were a student of and lover of Heidegger. So von Trotte has to somehow explore the Heidegger problem a little bit, right? But she doesn't want to do it too much because she thinks it's a distraction. So that might be dissatisfying, but it seems to me that's what they're doing there. Is they're like an accounting device for this objection.
Well, I of course think that these flashbacks to experience with Heidegger are crucial. And I think they're very well done, because I understood, which doesn't mean that it's understandable, but as we said, maybe the film is not really easily understood. It's crucial for several reasons. One is just, okay, to show her intellectual background, into which then von Trotte didn't go too far, because she never mentioned Jaspers in the movie, where the influence is just as important as this. But it's important exactly into this manner in which von Trotte wants to bring together personal and political. And so she has a couple of these flashbacks. When she was very, very young, she went to Heidegger and asked him to teach her thinking. The lessons of thinking turned into the love affair, which, as we know from other texts, was a very painful thing for her. Because besides becoming a Nazi, and I don't know whether it can be derived from Heideggerian philosophy or not, that's a debate, ongoing debate, really. It's very difficult to decide it, but besides his philosophy, he was a very rigid, conventional German Catholic, I mean. And the point is that Arendh, although having this very, very painful for her personal life, she was really young at that time, she was 18, and she became a lover of a distinguished Privatdozent, a professor, who will become later the dean into the Nazi times. And she struggles all her life, and I think this is what the flashbacks mean. She struggles all her time while struggling with Eichmann, with Jewishness, with Israelis, whom she immediately, the state of Israel, she immediately recognizes as something that might go wrong, actually. Starting with this trial, she struggles all the time with this experience and how to turn this experience into some kind of a basic worldliness, or not positive attitude toward the world, but just to, reconcile with the world, as she says. We have to understand, to be able to reconcile with the world in which we are, as Heidegger taught her, are thrown. The world existed before us, will exist afterwards, but we have to live our life in this world. So she goes back to this Heidegger for the first time, like she was so fascinated with this professor, who was obviously charming and lover and hypocrite, which she does write in a very short text, which was written in before she went second time in the when she, after the war, in I think in '49, she returned first time to Germany. But in the meantime, she wrote a short text which was called Heidegger the Fox. But of course, going on thinking, doing all this thinking, integrating all her experience, life experience, into the way that should be integrated through thinking is true. She is trying also to understand Heidegger, which I think is her biggest sin, after all. It's a great thing that she translated Heidegger and tried to make him understandable to the American public. But actually she really wanted to understand, and as we think on the second flashback, when she goes and she tries to tell him, go out and explain yourself, regardless whether she really believed him. Because what he does, he's just, you know, he pretends to be the infantile old man, but I think he's a dirty old man. Excuse me. I mean, the way he's treating her is, again, actually not fair. I mean, he's talking about her dress, looks, charms, and he doesn't want to address the important issues, as he never did through his life, until this interview to Spiegel, which was published after his death. So I think these are the episodes which are very important to show the way he was developing this relationship, understanding herself and integrating this past trauma into her present life, and in the end was even able to, in a way, forgive. Because forgiving is just as important as understanding, because the new beginning, and politics is always about new beginning. Politics gives us possibility to begin anew. So without understanding, without forgiving, we cannot have the new beginning, personally or as political communities.
Do you think that maybe we can think about this scene or her talking about Heidegger as some sort of ancestor of what Marcuse wrote a few decades later about conformism and how conformist freedom easily can become non-freedom?
Yeah, well, as she calls him, Heidegger the fox, which would basically mean the hypocrite, and conformism is probably the substantial part of hypocrisy. I mean, you conform, sometimes you believe in what you conform, sometimes not, sometimes you're just a hypocrite. What really Heidegger thought about it, he says that he doesn't understand politics. I mean, that's his excuse. I don't understand. I am somewhere much higher in metaphysics and beings and beings. And there is also the detail out of bibliography that she sends him the totalitarianism at certain points and expects his reactions. What he does, he wrote her back, this is not something he would read, but he did give it to his wife, Elfriede, who was actually a real Nazi follower, who was recruiting young students around Heidegger to the Nazi party. So, you know, the letters he writes to her, I keep on saying, you know, if somebody writes it to me or some of my friends, but just throw it away as a, you know, a really artificial romantic bullshit. But the letters he wrote to her. But obviously that was the culture in which Arendh, very young Arendh, believed that this is the expression of somebody's true, real emotions. Besides that, this somebody is a thinker. So yeah. Well, no, I don't think he was really the comforter. He was probably the hypocrite who had many good excuses. He's dealing with something so much higher than, you know, these life and death issues in here and the machinery of death that will be produced.
There's another thing which is not in a plain sight of this movie. That's the relation of Hannah Arendt with Israel state and with the whole idea of Zionism. And there's a, if you recall, there's a beautiful scene in her two visits to Jerusalem, there's a scene. She's at the same street, at the same stairs, and there's a different kind of girl standing on this stair. In the first visit, when she came first time in '96 to the trial, it's a girl in a uniform, more like a kind of idealistic resistance movement member, and not much later there is a girl in traditional Jewish costume. It's a small detail, but it shows also how the state rapidly changed in a very short time. And also when Tonči spoke in the beginning about this philosophy and philosophers on film, he mentioned a nice phrase, occupation of space. And I immediately recall a lecture by A.L. Weizmann, and later he developed that in papers, about the Israeli occupation of space today, in sense of Foucault's panopticon, how they are building new houses in a way and in a relationship to Palestinian place around, as they are exactly Foucault's panopticon, so it could be shown in any way. Basically, my question, my idea of how to go further is, we heard a little bit about Hannah Arendt today in the States, or at least in New York. What do you think, what is the relationship between Israel and Hannah Arendt, and Israel and banality of evil, in a way, today, in light of recent events?
Well, it's still very vexed. I would say that that book remains even more controversial in Israel than in New York City. Arendh had a very complicated relation to Israel. I mean, as the film makes clear, she was very involved in Zionist politics in Germany in the 30s or 20s, before she left. And those are exactly the people who the film has her going to visit in Jerusalem in 1960. But she had it seems that she had a vision of Israel as a refuge for European Jews after the Shoah, but not an exclusive one. She had what maybe we would today think of as a multi-ethnic, non-nationalist vision. And it was around the hardening up of Jewish identity in the Israeli Jewish identity, or Israeli identity as Jewish identity, in the Eichmann trial, that she became really profoundly worried. She had, in the very end of her still shocking essay, chapter about human rights and the nation state in the Origins of Totalitarianism book, she reflects on the irony that in the establishment of Israel and the notion of that the state, the nation state, is still the best defender of rights, the best organized institutional form that the protection of rights can take against the hollowness or emptiness of human rights, that in the pursuit of that, the Palestinian inhabitants of Palestine were lost many of their rights. But she still holds out the vision there of a shared civic space, which wouldn't be simply defined as Jewish or Palestinian. And I think already that was eroding in 1960, 61, 62. And her worries about it were very prescient. Right? She was writing before, remember, before the occupation in the strong sense, the occupation that Weitzman is arguing about. I mean, today, right, we would be happy with the borders, the 67 borders, or many people would be happy with the 67 borders.
Okay, since we have half an hour left, I would like to call the audience to join us in this discussion with comments or questions to our guests.
I'd like to address this issue, Mr. Keenan, when you mentioned and you said, okay, let's imagine what would have been if instead of Eichmann, Mossad had captured Mengele. Or don't you think that that case is a particularity of the very complex South American situation? I mean, the same question you could say, oh, why didn't they go to Chile, you know, to Las Condes and capture Ralph? You know, he was maybe even, you know, when we talk taxonomy of evil, who was the bigger Nazi, you know, then maybe Ralph should have been first on the list. But it was impossible to go through the fortress in Santiago de Chile. So it was easier to capture somebody in Buenos Aires, right? So.
Yeah, I'm not, I don't have a conspiratorial interpretation of this. It strikes me as a purely accidental decision. They could have taken one, they could have taken the other, but I think that the content of what would have emerged from the trial of the other would have been very different, and it would affect the way we think today about the Shoah. And I'm just saying that. Putting it in the category of accidents of history, that Mengele, the trial of Mengele would have been completely different. There would have been eyewitnesses to Mengele's crimes. So the witness question probably would remain the same, but what the witnesses would have testified to would have been very different, and it would have confirmed. I'm speculating. But I think it would have confirmed a more traditional understanding of what a war criminal was. It would have confirmed a notion of the you know, inner essential, to use your phrase, Vesna, the essential evil of the person, and the correspondence between or the notion that the acts are the expression of this inner demonic psychology. I don't know, imagine if that's the world of Holocaust interpretation that we've been living in for the 30 years between, or the 50 years between 1960 and now. I think it's just very different now, that's all, thanks to this accident of the one rather than the other.
I'm tempted here also to mention the fact that yes, I agree somewhat that it was luck that Eichmann happened to be that big, spectacular, really trial in Jerusalem and that Hannah Arendt had a chance to understand it in that way. But I think also very important that we didn't mention yet about the movie. That was for me, I didn't before know as much of that aspect, that Hannah Arendt then not only declared Eichmann as banality of evil, but also put the blame on the Jewish organizations. Now that, I think, was even more problematic for the Jews, that she blamed, you know, that's visible in the movie also, that she blamed the Jews for the Nazis. And so the whole, this identity, national identity suddenly, and also the belonging, you know, and I mean, this is almost the Good Samaritan of Jesus, where Hannah Arendt suddenly doesn't want to identify as Jew. but as a human being, right? And she claims even in the movie, Liebe dich is the only thing, not I don't like us, I don't love us, I love you. So I think that was so equally, I would say, in such a charged atmosphere of Nazism, in such a concentration camp, I mean, you know, that Hannah Arendt had the strength or the courage to openly do this. I think that is one of the extremely useful also things. And even the fact, I would say, that the Jews as victims of the Holocaust were so stressed, and as we heard yesterday, not really the Roma. Also not enough the atomic bomb in Japan, which was also another really, I don't know, that was bureaucracy, very simple one too, right? It was just one button to press and to create that. So there I find that courage of Hannah Arendt and something unique, I think, in under the circumstances.
Anyone else?
Since we're here in Croatia, which is part of the former Yugoslavia, I'd like to ask you if you have some comments on the banality of evil, looking at Slobodan Milosevic trials, other trials in front of the tribunal in the former Yugoslavia, and how lessons from Eichmann weren't learned in the war here.
Weren't learned in the war, or weren't learned in the post-war?
Pre-war. I do think that the administration that was in place in former Yugoslavia definitely had something to do with the crimes committed here. So, if you had any ideas on that, or if you researched it, would be my question.
I would be hesitant to comment so much on the background or on the pre-war, but certainly I think. I mean, not because I'm shy about it, but just because it seems kind of silly for a guy from New York to come to Zagreb and offer opinions about the war here. But I would say about the trials afterwards. There would be a lot to say about the legacy of the Eichmann trial in The Hague. Some which reflects well on The Hague, and some which reflects badly. I think that one of the virtues which Arendh acknowledges, one of the perverse virtues of the illegal kidnapping of Eichmann from Argentina, was that there was the opportunity for justice. Not only there was an institutional mechanism that not only rendered justice to the accused, but also did it publicly. Right? Did it publicly in front of the people whose lives had been changed by the crimes he committed. He was charged with committing. So she thinks they took that to an extreme. That they gave the victims control over the trial in a way which betrayed the classic understanding of what differentiated justice from revenge, and that the trial bordered not only on being a show trial but also on being an experiment in revenge by putting the victims and the accused directly in confrontation with each other without so much mediation. But she appreciates the fact that the classic notion that justice must be seen in order to be done, that there's a public dimension to the work of justice, was in fact honored there. That, I think, maybe was a lesson not so well learned by parking the trials of Yugoslav war criminals in an out-of-the-way, low-lying country on the Atlantic. And I think that flaw, that structural flaw of the ICTY, in the name of the rigor and legal seriousness of the trial as such, you know, in the name of independent international justice. I think that was a serious problem. Has been, remains an ongoing serious problem for international criminal justice as a whole. So I think some connection, some heightened sense of what publicity and what visibility and what accountability to the people and places where the crimes happened, I think that's an important and unlearned lesson, maybe. The other thing I would say is thinking about the recent news, and here I'll just, you guys can really, you can slap me and correct me if I'm speaking out of place, because I know I am. But if I'm misspeaking out of place, you can slap me. But I was struck by my own confusion about the recent acquittal of the Croatian generals. And on the one hand, let's say, since I had always thought that the case against them was rather persuasive, I was surprised by the fact that they were released. But then I caught myself hesitating at my own surprise, or hesitating at my own disappointment, and thinking that this is in fact one of those perverse problems or outcomes of committing oneself to the notion of an international court system. Is that there, if it's at all half of what it claims to be, it has to have the capacity of acquitting and releasing the people, no matter how self-evident in a non-legal sense their guilt seemed to be. So if you're going to entrust the adjudication of these events to something like a court, then you need more or less to be willing to live with the results. If you're not, then you should go for some other mechanism of justice, whether it's executions without trial, or the maintenance of war, or a truth commission, or any number of other things. So I found myself very, as you can see, confused by that outcome. And I think, in a sense, there, the definitiveness of the Eichmann example is misleading. It was a trial, and the Israelis said, in fact, the Mossad guy who kidnapped Eichmann said, in what, 50 years later seems a bit ironic or hypocritical, he says, we don't shoot people. We want to put them on trial and exhibit their crimes for everyone to see. So there was a commitment to some notion of justice, even if it seemed like the outcome was preordained. I'd say we're now living in a world of international justice in which that's not the case anymore. That the instruments, the institutions are serious enough that people are getting acquitted. Even if it seems, again, in non-legal terms, that we know they're guilty. The legal definition of guilt, which is what we're committing ourselves to, is different than the journalistic or common sense notion of guilt. For me, that's two simple ways. I don't know if that actually answers your question.
Can I comment something on the question? I mean, if I understood well, you said that it could be some similarity drawn between the bureaucratic system of social bureaucracy of former Yugoslavia and
yes, that's
totalitarianism as Arendh describes it.
I'm just trying to draw conclusions that could have been drawn before the war in former Yugoslavia started, and seeing trials in The Hague of smaller administrative people within the system reminds me of Eichmann.
Well, there was one big guy there, he died, and the other died before.
Yeah.
That was just an actual fact. But I just wanted to underline one thing, that Arendh makes a huge difference. She insists that any other form of former political